Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you all today to our forum in Washington, D.C. As you all know, tomorrow is Earth Day. In fact, the 36th anniversary of the holiday. And preceding our panel, we had 5 expert scientists and economists talking about some of the science of the theme of this Earth Day, which is global warming or climate change, if you prefer. But either way, it's a very hot topic, especially in a town like Washington, D.C., a very political town. What we'd like to offer today is a panel on responses to global warming. Our speakers will talk about the science, but also the religious beliefs and the application of those beliefs to this concern over climate change. I should first say that we have an audience here, but also anyone watching on the internet is welcome to send in questions, and that will come after we have our presentation. So let me give you an 800 number, so to speak, but it's on your internet. It's it's education@earthday.net. So in half an hour, get ready to send in your questions if you have any. Our panel today is sponsored by Earth Day Network, which is one of the largest national organizations to educate people on ecological issues. And with this panel, they're launching a 3-year education project, trying to explain to the general public, to houses of worship, to public schools, about the concerns of climate change and what ordinary people can do about it. This is in cooperation with the Regeneration Project, which has another project called Interfaith Power and Light Program, which Rabbi Swartz will tell us a little bit later. So it's an interlocking sponsorship. Now, my name is Larry Witham, and the reason they chose me to moderate is for about 20 years I was a newspaper reporter in Washington. And as you know, journalists don't take positions. We just ask questions. So I'm not here to advocate in particular, but I'm going to encourage our distinguished panelists to advocate with passion and insight. And I think we'll learn a lot from that. The format of the program, I will introduce our 4 panelists, and then each will have about 8 minutes to speak. And speaking of science, we have a little technology here today. When that goes up, they have 1 minute left. And once that's over, I will ask some opening questions to get the panel interacting, and then we hope you in the audience can respond as well. So we're going to begin with Rabbi Daniel Swartz, who has worked for many years in Washington. He has been moving between religion and science since his ordination as a Reform rabbi and his degrees at Brown University in geological science and environmental policy. So he has an ideal background in this, and he was an associate director of the National Religious Partnership on the Environment. He's worked with children on this educational topic, and he's published a guide to Jewish tradition on ecology. And right now, he's working with Interfaith Power and Light and a project with the Washington Interfaith Conference and the Church's Center on Theology and Public Policy, which is a national center, but it's located at Wesley Theological Seminary here in Washington. Thanks for being here, Rabbi.
Glad to be here.
Next to my left is the Reverend Richard Cizik. He is somebody you'll see at many very large religious gatherings, but he also walks the halls of Congress. I don't know if every day, but very often. Richard is a Presbyterian minister, and most important for our panel is he's Vice President for Governmental Affairs for the National Association of Evangelicals. That's the largest coalition of conservative Protestant evangelical churches. Reverend Cizik has traveled the world, especially China. He's something of an expert on China. But he's still found time to complete graduate degrees in politics and public affairs, and of course a master's in divinity required for ordination, and he's also received an honorary doctorate in ministry. Mr. Cizik is a great defender of religious liberty, I think a topic he's championed here in Washington. He's been editor of The High Cost of Indifference, and I think the title shows you that he's concerned about citizenship, social responsibility. So thanks for being here, Richard.
Thank you, Larry.
Next is Reverend Alida DeCoster. Thank you for being here. Another local light. Alida, for 12 years, served at a Unitarian Universalist Association congregation in Maryland. And being a pastor is not easy. So she's busier now working with young adults with the Social Justice Internship Program at the Unitarian Universalist Washington office, which is their lobby or advocacy office here. She is the author of such essays as Deep Ecology, Spinning Out the Interdependent Web, and I think most important for our discussion here, she's a spiritual director working with individuals and retreats. She got her training in that at the well-known Shalem Institute here in Maryland. And she says spiritual direction, as ancient as it is a contemporary practice that will still help people keep their spiritual center in a hectic world. And finally, Imam Yahya Hindi, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Imam Hindi is the first full-time Muslim chaplain hired at an American university, and that's right here in Washington, Georgetown University. There he serves as prayer leader and a counselor, and he is also imam or prayer leader of the Islamic Society of Frederick, which is a little bit north of Washington. He earned his Master's of Divinity at Hartford Seminary, historic Protestant school in Connecticut, and he's now completing a doctorate. All of this was in comparative religion. In his spare time, I'm sure, he is Muslim chaplain at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. He teaches courses at McDaniel College in Maryland and is spokesman for the Islamic Jurisprudence Council of North America. Thank you for joining us. I would like to kick us off with a little time travel. The science this morning talked about the future. Can we predict the problem of climate change? Well, the question of religion and nature is age-old. So let's go back a little bit. We could go back to anywhere, but I've selected 1750 in colonial America. If we were there and we were out in the western woods of Massachusetts, we might well meet a fellow named Jonathan Edwards, a Puritan theologian. In hindsight, he is considered probably America's first and greatest theologian. And many of you may know him by his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But Edwards also had a theology of nature. He believed that God was experienced in all things, in all natural things. Well, it's not surprising in this age of environmental consciousness that many people are claiming that Edwards was a Puritan green, or a green Puritan, whatever you prefer. Now let's fast forward 200 years to the 1950s. That was my parents' generation, maybe some of your grandparents' generation. For them, the topic was natural resources and, quote, conservation of nature. One church, the Presbyterians, declared in 1954 that a Christian's conscience must, quote, recognize our stewardship of earth and water. So here was the beginning. The 50s, that's when the first modern legislation on the environment came out, the Fish and Wildlife Act. In the 1960s, the Roman Catholic Church held its worldwide Second Vatican Council, brought the cardinals from all over the world, and they declared that, quote, an ordering of the whole creation gives praise of the Creator. Of course, this is the decade when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, popularized the problem of pesticides, and Congress began to pass the first Wilderness Acts. Then came 1970, and that was the founding of Earth Day, held on April 22nd every year since. Now listen to what the Evangelical Christians said way back in 1970. Scientists are alarmed. The next year, the Evangelicals also spoke of, quote, environmental problems of huge proportions. So the awareness is growing already. From 1970 onward, the environmental debate gets very interesting. We hear about nuclear waste, lead paint, acid rain, and the greenhouse effect. Our concepts also become futuristic. There is spaceship Earth, and there is Gaia. That's the Greek word for Earth as a living organism. But traditional religious groups also are keeping up. The Pope and the Ecumenical Patriarch began to talk about saving the world environment. When scientists issued an open letter to the religious community in 1990, all of a sudden the religious organizations became active. In 1993, the umbrella group, National Religious Partnership for the Environment, formed between Jewish and Christian groups. Today, probably every denomination has some kind of ecology-minded activity, and that's what we're going to look at today. But most exciting for Americans, it seems, is the end of the world. We have it in movies and we have it in novels. There was Waterworld, if you're a Kevin Costner fan, and recently The Day After Tomorrow, if you live in Manhattan. Many of you may want to see the new documentary called The Great Warming, a very serious piece of reporting. Did you know that the best-selling novel of this century is about the end of the world? But it's not about global warming. It's about God coming to destroy the earth. And it's called Left Behind, which is what happens to some of us, I suppose. In any case, this is the kind of religious diversity that we have in America today in the age of climate change. The science brings us down to earth, but we're not going to be shy at all about God talk, about values and morals. And our job is to look at the religious response to science in belief and practice. And we're going to begin with our eldest tradition, with Rabbi Swartz, since the ancient words in Genesis got the whole thing started. Rabbi Swartz, please.
Thanks. I'd like to share today a number of principles, some of which I think we will all share, and a few of which may be particular to the Jewish tradition, to get us thinking in terms of this environmental responsibility and how we address climate change. And I'd like to think of them playing off of one of the discussion points from the scientists earlier on about the notion of wedges, of introducing ideas or technologies that start change and then can be pushed along to help that change keep coming. And I believe that just as there are scientific wedges and technological wedges, there are also going to be moral and ethical wedges that the religious community has a chance to help push forward. And so here are some of the wedges that I think we can offer. The first and most important by far is simply the notion of God. The fact that we don't own this world, we don't even owe it to future generations, but that it is something that we keep in trust for an eternal God. A God who is greater than any politics, greater than any nation, even greater than the great golden calf of our age, the economy. About 200 years ago, you had a different debate among nations of the world that talked about a great economic engine that some said was too important to ever get rid of, and others said that the world could exist without it. And one of the things that turned that debate was the moral question, because what I was talking about is something that we would today regard as an absolute evil, that of slavery. But it was defended in its time as necessary for economic growth. And it wasn't until people brought in that notion, listen, a human being can't own another human being because we are all equally children of God, that we were able to say, this is not an economic debate. This is not a question of how much money can be made. This is wrong, and we have to stop it. When we put things in the context of God, we can see that there are things that are simply wrong, and we need to stop doing them. The second wedge is hope. I think it's easy to listen to a couple of hours about the science of climate change and get very depressed. One of the problems with getting depressed is that you want to retreat and you don't want to do anything. You feel depressed, you want to go back to sleep. And it's time to wake up instead. And we know that even in situations that look hopeless, that there can be hope. Pharaoh was the strongest political leader of his time. And the Israelites were at the bottom of the economic heap. And yet Pharaoh is gone and the people of Israel live and became free and redeemed. And there are hundreds of stories across the world of that religious hope taking people who were alone and bringing them to a place where they have made great social change. The next is connection. And I'm not just talking about the connection between us and between people of different faiths, all of us in different ways as God's children, but also our connection to the world around us. One of the exercises I often do when I'm talking to groups about faith and environment is ask them to close their eyes and picture the word environment in their mind. And get that image firmly in mind, and then I ask them to raise their hand if there are any people in that picture. And almost universally there aren't. We have this feeling today in America that the environment is something out there. It's whales and wilderness or parks and pandas. It's separate from us. What happens there doesn't affect us, and what we do doesn't affect it. But really, everything all around us is the environment. We are inextricably connected to the world around us. It is where we live and eat and play, and our parents and our children, and learn and work. And so understanding that if it is God's universe, everything in it is connected through that notion of God, that we can move together. Then the last general principle is simply that of justice. We'll hear a lot more, I think, over the course of this time about how climate change affects, first and foremost, those that the gospel would call the least among us, those who are the poorest, with the least political power, that are discriminated against in many other ways. And these are specifically the people that each of the faith traditions represented here today are call upon us to fight for, to work on behalf of, and to make sure that they live decent and whole lives. Two specific Jewish principles have to do, on the one hand, with setting a physical boundary, and the other hand, with setting a boundary in time. The physical boundary is the principle that we call ma'akeh. It's from a commandment in the book of Deuteronomy that talks about parapets on a roof. And we talked a lot about in the last panel about the notion of a tipping point. And the thing about a ma'akeh is that it reminds us that when there's a tipping point, things fall off. And that the idea is to stop something from falling off rather than picking up the pieces after it has fallen off. So that you're commanded to build a parapet around your roof. You're not commanded to avoid falling off the roof. You're not told, if thou fallest off the roof, tough luck. You're told, prevent blood guilt by taking steps in advance to stop a problem before it happens. And the time boundary issue is the gift of the Sabbath, of Shabbat. And the Sabbath reminds us that we are not, despite all the commercials we hear, fundamentally consumers. That is not our identity. We are people. We are humans. We are created in the image of God. And it is precisely when we say we have enough, not when we're buying, not when we're consuming, not when we're trying to fix things, that we can come closest to our potential, that we can come closest to each other, that we can come closest to our Creator God. And so to understand the human nature as something that can accept the world around us and enjoy it is, I think, fundamentally important for us as we look for the kinds of transformations that we'll need as we address climate change.
Thank you very much. And one contribution of Judaism to the whole world is something called ethical monotheism, and I can see why it's so universal. It's such a practical application of the idea of God and humanity and our daily life. Now we turn to Richard Cizik with the National Association of Evangelicals.
Thank you, Larry. I would like to say that, look, the importance of science and the panel we've just heard from is incredibly important. I believe the science of climate change, but sad to say, not all Americans do, and frankly, a lot of evangelical Christians do not either believe the science of climate change. In fact, the most recent study shows, Larry, that 12% fewer evangelicals believe environmental scientists than do the general public, amazingly enough. And one has to ask, why? What has happened here that millions of Americans do not believe what is occurring to the world around us? Well, it's been put this way, and I like to explain it as such. Climate change is often considered the consequence of the religion-science debate in America. In other words, scientists believe in evolution, Christians reject evolution, therefore millions of Christians reject what scientists say about climate change. Hence, climate change has been sort of the third rail. You touch it, you die. I've discovered that because of my own story. So I'll use just a few moments to say my own narrative. Look, the media doesn't do a very good a very good job of teaching atmospheric science. It's complex. Climate change is a scientific phenomenon. Scientists have identified it, studied it, explained it, but it can't be only science and technology that provide the roadmap to dealing with it. And that's because you have a significant percentage of the public that just rejects the idea that it's occurring. Well, it's natural phenomena, we're told. Now, I went to an Oxford conference on climate change, my friends, in 2002 with that same position. Well, scientists said it was occurring. Some said it wasn't occurring. I was allowed to simply be ethically neutral on this. I was allowed to be a mugwump. I have a political science degree. A mugwump is someone with a mug on one side and a wump on the other side of the fence. And you could just sit there and do nothing. And sad to say, tragically, millions of people today are mugwumps. And I met Sir John Houghton at the conference, an evangelical who also happens to be one of the principal scientists of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In fact, was one of the major leaders of IPCC. And what happened was this. I spent time with the scientists, the best scientists of the world, some of the best religious and ethicists of the world, and I came away convinced I could no longer be a mugwump. And that was 2002. And since that time, I've considered it my challenge to say to my fellow Christians and to other people that this is not just a scientific issue, though it is. It's not just a political issue, though it is. It is first and foremost, and it's not just an environmental issue, though it is that too, but it's first and foremost, to me, a moral and spiritual issue that every American, and frankly every member of our globe, has to begin to deal with. Essentially, it's a moral and spiritual issue. And since having that experience, which I've likened to being a conversion, not unlike my conversion to faith in Christ, I've changed. I've changed the way I live. I've changed the way my family lives. The lifestyle we've adopted, we changed. For example, we sold our RV, our recreational vehicle. It got 8 miles to the gallon. We loved it, but we didn't need it that much. We sold our cars and bought Priuses. We've changed the heating and air conditioning system in our house. We've done a lot of different things. We can talk about those and what our responsibility is. But I just have to say, for my 8 minutes, this is a challenge we have to take very seriously. Evangelical Christians have not participated in this debate. They must. So last night I was at Messiah College and spent time with 150 community leaders in Grantham, Pennsylvania, who together said, in watching the Great Warming, which I understand is on the website for Earth Day, that we as a community are going to change. We're going to abide by what we call at the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals, our call to responsibility, our civic call to responsibility, a document which, by the way, says, I didn't purposely print it green, but it is green. Didn't purposely make the seventh principle, we labor to protect God's creation, the seventh principle, but in the Bible the seven is a perfect number. But it says, because clean air, pure water, and adequate resources are crucial to public health and civic order, government has an obligation to protect its citizens. I believe government today has squandered its responsibility. Our political leaders have failed to live up to their God-given responsibility to deal with climate change, and that's one of the conclusions of a recent document evangelical leaders have released called Climate Change, an Evangelical Call to Action. We can explore some of these ideas, why climate change hasn't been accepted as a mandate by, for example, our current president and the current Congress, but it must be. And I want to do my part, and I know my fellow clergy here want to do it too. That is our civic duty to make sure we address this issue. Thank you for inviting me.
Now Richard's comment about what he drives, I think we're all thinking about this today, but I can pop off as the moderator. We had the slogan, what would Jesus drive? You may have heard that. And I asked the rabbi here, what would Moses drive? Well, we could go down the line, but earlier we heard that from people around the panel here that in Maryland they passed some new environmental legislation. And one of the people working on that said it was to the credit of the local Unitarian Universalist Association churches. So Alita DeCoster is here today from their national office. She was a local pastor, but now working with young adults in the art of education and advocacy, right?
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. Unitarianism and Universalism both have long histories in Western theology. These two North American denominations merged in 1961 and carry on a heritage which comes out of the radical wing of the Protestant Reformation. Today we are united by deeply held ethical principles while leaving particular points of theology open to individual experience and conscience. Our principles include believing in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, the right of conscience, the use of the democratic process, and most relevant here today, our seventh principle, the respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are a part. We honor all religious traditions as sources of wisdom and hold to heart the spirit of the great commandment of Judaism and Christianity, to love God as we understand God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. All traditions have at their heart a reverence for life and a version of the golden rule. While beliefs about life determine our actions, it is actions by which we judge ourselves and others. As we see it, the fundamental purposes of the religious life are to live morally and to grow in faith. As we have grown in faith in recent decades, it has become increasingly clear that the community in which we live is more than a human community. We have come to see the entire creation as worthy of reverence and respect. We now recognize that our precious environment is being plundered for material purposes to such an extent that finally we will be the cause of our own destruction, even as we have caused the destruction of innumerable species already, by our incursion into their habitats and unregulated consumption. We have not remembered or relearned the wisdom of our ancestors in avoiding waste, respecting nature, and preserving resources. Today, due to urbanization and industrialization, most of us are cut off from a real relationship with the forces of nature, such that we have lost respect for our place in the cycle of life. And we are seeing the result of our negligence. Whatever percentage of today's climate change is due to human waste and pollution, any percentage is too much. This is an issue of morality in our failure to adapt our behavior to changing reality. It is an issue of faith in our failure to revere creation adequately to make changes. The General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association has produced more than 24 social witness statements on environmental justice, alternative energy sources, and responsible consumption since 1977. Our current draft statement of conscience on climate change awaits approval at our June annual meeting. And I will now quote a few sentences from the draft relevant to our discussion here. I will skip the portion on science, as we have been so well informed by our panel of scientists earlier. And here the quotes begin. As a matter of faith, based on our seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part, we are called to defer to a balance between our individual needs and those of all other organisms. To live, we must both consume and dispose. Both our consumption and our disposal burden the interdependent web of existence. To sustain the interdependent web, we must burden it less, while maintaining the essentials of our lives. We are called to live more simply and more mindfully. As a matter of policy, economically developing countries will be unable to protect their residents from rising sea levels, increasingly intense droughts, rains, hurricanes, and tornadoes. It is a grave injustice that economically developed countries which are most responsible for climate change possess the wealth, technology, and infrastructure to cope with its negative effects, while those who have the least will have the largest burdens to bear. As a call to action, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, pledge to ground our missions and ministries in reverence for this earth and responsibility to it. The statement, that's the end of the quote, the statement then lists personal practices, congregational actions, and advocacy goals. These include all types of energy reduction practices, educational and planning innovations, and promotion of alternate energy technology. The Unitarian Universalist Ministry for the Earth, an educational and advocacy organization within the UUA, has a green sanctuary certification process similar to the Interfaith Power and Light program. In 2005, a study was published by our Commission on Appraisal titled Engaging Our Theological Diversity. Over 3 years, laity and clergy were extensively polled and interviewed to determine what common ground we have theologically. The results show strong commonality in our affirmation of the seventh principle, the interconnected web, supported by some 90% of us, as the ground of our personal theology. Minister and Professor David Bumbaugh writes, "The seventh principle calls us to reverence before the world, not some future world, but this miraculous world of our everyday experience. It challenges us to understand the world as relational. It calls us to trust the creative, evolving, renewing, redeeming process which brings us into being, which sustains us in being, and which transforms our being. It offers a vision of a world in which the holy, the sacred, is incarnated in every moment, in every aspect of being, a world in which God is always fully present and in which God is always fully at risk." End of quote. In a postmodern world, right relation is not just an ideal between human beings and cultures, but among all species of living things, all of life. In such an ethic, such a theology, we must recognize that life, while sacred, is not simple. But we are one part of the miraculous, complex whole of creation which inspires wonder and reverence. Our own sense of belonging leads us to an ethic of care. We are co-creators. We must choose to care enough to be willing to change our course from wanton destruction of nature to recognition of ourselves as integral to nature. Will enough of us heed the call? We fail to respond at our peril. Therefore, in the words of Micah, let us do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. And perhaps the trees shall clap their hands.
Thank you very much. We have a group of public educators here today, but probably the busiest of the educators has been Imam Hindi, who's been doing his tasks, including Friday prayers at the university and elsewhere. He appeared on a national radio show this morning, and he could make time for us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Will. The honor is mine to be with you this afternoon. For me, this is a very important event, not only because we are speaking on an issue that is important to all of us, but rather because I believe we are sending a message today to everyone who is listening, maybe to the world, that our religions are not at odds with each other. We are not enemies of each other. We do have differences and unique differences between our religions, but we can make this world work. We can get together. We can come together. We can unite on many issues that bring us all together. I wish this could be broadcasted to every home in the world. You know, I wish Osama bin Laden could hear this. I wish the extremists could see this now, because here it is where we find a way for us to unite and to come together. The problem for me today is that I was trained by a Baptist minister to preach. And he always told me, when you start speaking, remember the Holy Spirit. And if the Holy Spirit is with you, you can go on for hours. And if that's my style, guys, you need to sit back and take your time and maybe order your dinner today. I'll try not to do that though now. I want to just focus on a few issues in regard with this issue within the teachings of Islam. And I start with the first one, and that is the concept of Tawheed, maintaining the oneness of God. If you want to summarize Islam in one word, I would say it's Tawheed, Tawhid, and that is that to be a Muslim, you have to maintain the oneness of God. And maintaining the oneness of God means in Islam to honor God. And to honor God, you need to honor the creation of God. Maintaining the oneness of God means in Islam to believe that God is perfect, and hence everything that comes out of God is also perfect. And therefore, this universe, this earth on which we live, are also perfect. It is us human beings who may bring about a destruction to that order and perfection to the creation of God. In accordance with that concept of Tawheed, one has to be humble, one has to be constrained, and one has to be in self-control. That concept of Tawheed, or maintaining the oneness of God, tells us that if you want to betray that oneness of God, you become arrogant, you become greedy, and you become self-centered. And I think what is really happening around us in this world is that we have become so much greedy, so much arrogant, so much self-centered, to the point we are willing to destroy the creation of God. We are willing to bring down this harmony that God inserted in this earth for our own self-eagerness, if you will, and interest. The other thing is that according to Islam, God's creation operate with harmony. And this creation is not only made for human beings, it's also made for each and every element in the creation of God. And we ought to work as partners in maintaining this creation of God. The Arabic word for dust is turab. If I want to translate the word turab back to English, I wouldn't say dust. The Arabic word turab means dust, but also means to raise up and to put up, which means, according to Islam, we human beings are created from dust, not dirt, dust. We are created from an essence that is raised, highly honored, and respected. And therefore, the essence of man is honor. The essence of man is respected. And if we were to respect ourselves, we have to respect our essence. If we were to respect ourselves as human beings, we have to respect the essence from which we came, and that is dust. And if we fail to respect dust, we fail to respect our essence and our origin from which we originated as human beings. If from dust we come, to dust we return, as Islam says. And this is why in Islamic theology it is prohibited in Islamic ethics to curse dust. And Islam teaches that if you curse dust, you actually curse yourself, because that's from which you come, and you curse God, because dust also speaks about the sophistication in the divine mind, if you will, who brought about this dust and this universe. In Islam also we read in the Quran, in the Muslims' Holy Scripture, that everything I see around me is a living entity, and everything I see around me praises God in its own way. The stone praises God, dust praises God, trees praise God. So they have their own way of connecting with God. I may not be able as a human being to see and how this tree communicates with God, but it does in its own way. And therefore, everything around me is really of a living essence in it. And therefore, I better as a human being humble myself and honor that living entity, whether I understand it or not. Islam speaks about against the قتل النفس التي فيها حياة, that as a Muslim you cannot kill the soul with which there is life. And if dust has life in it, if stones have life in it, if air has life in it, if I don't understand it, killing air is killing God himself, and will be considered a murder, a spiritual murder and a moral murder to dust, to air, if you will. So polluting the air is if you will, a spiritual crime that one may commit against air. According to this theology, human beings are just one element in the creation of God, and human beings are equal to earth, to water, to plants, to animals, to oceans. And hence, since they are equal partners, they have to cooperate with each other in maintaining this universe and the creation of God. How would Islam tell us as Muslims to deal with this issue of global warming, if you will, or climate change, or environment, and how to handle it? Very specific practices, such as Islam tells us that when we eat, we have to eat in a moderate way and not in an excessive way, We eat vegetables, but we also eat meat. But we don't go far into eating meat on the expense of vegetables. We don't do both on the expense of water. We do that in a moderate way. So our eating habits have to be right and have to be done in a way that to preserve the dignity of earth and air and plants that we come across. Islam tells us to walk and get used to the habit of walking. Prophet Muhammad used to walk for hours after his night prayer in order to create a relationship with light, with time, and with space. The concept of ummah in Islam, the concept of the community, that the community has to work internally to protect the land. Islam spoke about how when you go to prayer, you are supposed to find someone who would go with you. So I guess in modern language, if instead of driving 5 cars to the mosque or to the church or to the synagogue, if we can maintain 5 people going in 1 car, how much help will that be to the environment? And Muhammad spoke about that many times. That try to use one piece of transportation to go for a prayer. To conclude, like the concept of fasting in Islam, that you really deny yourself food and drink for at least 13 to 15 hours every day. You deny yourself basic needs that you would otherwise need, only to teach yourself how to give up on basic needs for the sake of the whole, for the sake of the other, giving up on water, on coffee, and on drink, and on food. Can we make it with less? I think we can make it with less. Though this greedy personality, greedy culture, self-centered culture taught us, no, I need coffee every day in the morning, I need coffee every day in the evening. And say, no, fasting teaches you maybe 1 time a week is enough, maybe 1 time a month is enough. So looking into this self-control, being in self-control is what really matters. My last point is about Abraham. Very often people debate between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism whether the sacrifice was supposed to be Ishmael or Isaac. And I say in Islam this really does not make sense. It does not matter whether it was supposed to be Ishmael or Isaac. For me, it's not only about God asking Abraham to give up on his son, because that would make God very violent, bloody God, and God would not ever do that. However, I think God was asking Abraham to give up on something that is so dear to him for the glory of God. So in relation to the topic we are discussing today, can we give up something that's so dear to us for the glory of God? Whether food or air or whatever it is, I think we can do it if we are really self-centered, if we are not self-centered, and if we are focused on God and willing to work with the environment and the creation of the Almighty One. Thank you.
Thank you. That was one of the most concise sermons I've heard in a long time. Congratulations. I will be willing to walk 5 miles, but I don't think I'll give up my coffee in the morning. And we've learned, for you Americans, there's an Islamic basis for the HOV lane. So we'll look at that. Let's return to the science and deal with some of that before we move on, because a lot of great topics have been opened here. Americans in general are not very scientifically literate. We've heard that at the previous panel. And not many can, in fact, tell us what the 4 Gospels are. I think half of Americans know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So literacy is a problem in general. But about science, how do your religious communities, conservative and liberal, how do they feel about teaching their members science? And how do you think your members really understand science? Because scientists are saying, here's a moral issue and we've got to do something about it. So maybe we can just go through the traditions here.
I think it's important for us to try to understand ways in which that science and faith can and should be complementary. And that is, I think, going to require some thinking and modesty both amongst religious folks but also amongst scientists. And that is to understand that science is very good at helping us understand the empirical is. But that religion teaches us, first of all, that there are other ises besides the empirical, that there's faith in things unseen, as it's been put, but also that is doesn't equal ought, that what is happening doesn't equal what should be happening, and that what goes on in the natural world is not necessarily an ethical guide for us as human beings. With that said, then we learn, listen, it doesn't matter how much you want the empirical is to be different. You can wish all you want for the world to be flat. It ain't flat. You can wish all you want for Earth to be in the center of the universe. It isn't. And so understanding that we need to be literate about the real ises of the world, and to understand how to dialogue with scientists about that is important. I think I have seen in the past decade a movement among some scientists, at least, to understand with a little humility about the difference between is and ought, and that when they speak as an advocate, they're speaking from their passion as a human being and their morals and their values, and that's important. But we did go through a period in this country where I can understand that tension between folks feeling that you have to choose between science and religion, because it really did feel like science became the new religion, and where belief in anything became something that was because you were dumb. And we need to move away from that and understand that thinking and believing can coexist.
Richard, do you think the well-educated evangelicals of America can understand that 1 degree Fahrenheit over 100 years is a really big thing? It's not just like it was hotter yesterday and cooler today. 1 degree Fahrenheit.
Look, I don't think there's the conflict between religion and science that people would think. Do we agree on ultimate realities? No. Do scientists acknowledge that God exists? Many do. Millions do. Not all do. Many are evolutionary biologists. For example, I had lunch not so many days ago, in fact, just a few weeks ago, with probably the most famous of all evolutionary biologists, Edwin O. Wilson from Harvard. And the purpose, interestingly enough, of the lunch was to discuss the prospect of theologians and scientists coming together to say, we can't necessarily agree on ultimate realities of God or not, but we should be able to agree that climate change is occurring, and that together, as scientists and as religious leaders, we're committed to speaking to the American people and the public that this is an important priority, and that's going to happen. But isn't it interesting that there are those who would suspect, well, what about Dr. Wilson? He's an evolutionist, and the evangelicals, they are certainly opposed to evolution, and obviously never the twain shall meet. Au contraire. I happen to believe that the issue today that we face on climate change will be an issue which will bring us to a greater respect for one another. Why? Because religious leaders are increasingly the mediums. I picked that word from former Vice President Al Gore, who said just a few blocks away from here at the National Geographic Society in presenting his new movie, it's called An Inconvenient Truth about climate change, that he said religious leaders are playing this kind of translator for people who don't accept the science, that the science is true. Now, look, I wish everyone did accept the science, but for those who don't, I think religious leaders play a role in justifying it, and if you will, baptizing it, and saying that it is real, it's true. And if we can play that role, then I think we're playing a God-given role.
They say sprinkling holy water on it sometimes.
Yeah,
right?
Maybe so.
Now, there's been surveys about the religious backgrounds of American scientists, and lo and behold, most of them were Unitarians, at least in the old days. So explain that to us, Alida.
Well, I'm happy to. We are truly the children of the Enlightenment. We try to, we grew out of that idea of, empiricism will be the salvation of humanity, and we will solve every problem ultimately through scientific inquiry and discovery. What we're finding, ironically, we're in a little bit of a different position, that we're learning to balance our reason more with faith and recognizing some of the limits of science. Research shows that research contradicts itself more often than we'd like. So, in this sort of postmodern era, we're calling into question some of our solid rock-bottom assumptions about what science can do for us. At the same time, we'll always be testing empirically whether things ring true. I think that as a spiritual director with someone who I feel this gift from the Christian tradition of this tradition of discernment, of checking in with that own heartfelt sense of truth, informed by prayer, informed by authorities, informed by friends, but ultimately listening to that still small voice within. That's a kind of empiricism as well. And so we lift up empiricism, whether it's science, whether it's spirituality.
Imam, you know the great debate on who saved Western science. You know, one view is that the Muslims, found it during the Middle Ages and restored Aristotle back to the Christians, and then they began modern science. And another interesting thing we hear is that many conservative Muslims are into technology and engineering, all over the world. So,
the word knowledge, ilm in Arabic, and mind, aql in Arabic, are repeated in the Quran 668 times. And the Muslim earlier, traditionally Muslim exegesis scholars understood that to mean a divine mandate for us human beings to explore the creation of God, and that knowledge would become God's gift to us as human beings. Muslim scholars would differentiate between what they call haqiqa ilmiya and dhann ilmi, scientific fact and scientific uncertainty. And therefore, if we are speaking about a scientific fact, there will be absolutely no contradiction between it and Islam and religion. But if we are talking about uncertainties within science, then there can be a debate. However, Muslims speak about what they call the culture of debate between scholars of theology and scholars of science, that there has to be an ongoing, progressive culture of debate between both communities for the best of all. In other words, that both sides have to listen to each other, not exclude each other and alienate each other.
As a Muslim population, how do they view the scientific technological world? The pointy-headed scientists from the West who come over and want to do all these things in the developing world. What's the Muslim view?
It's quite amazing. I have been traveling to Muslim countries. I was in Qatar, the Gulf states, in October, and I just came back this last week. A huge difference within 6 months between what I saw in October and what I am seeing now. Absolute interest in advancing, in moving forward, in building universities, colleges. In Qatar, in a city, a very small city called Doha, there are 5 American universities to teach engineering, chemistry, medicine. You go to Abu Dhabi, half an hour away from there, you find all of these American universities and European universities are being imported to the Arab and Muslim world to teach science. So they have this fascination with Western science. And I think it is happening in a very healthy way, but where you have a debate between both communities as to what to do about it and how to go about that. Yeah.
I'd like to remind our viewers, if you're with us on the internet, you can send in questions, and that's at education@earthnet.com or org. Let me make sure. .net, earthday.net. Let's move to politics. We're in Washington. An often cited poll says that religious voters, people who say they have a religious background and show up and vote, their greatest concern is environmental issues, even more than hot topics like abortion and gay rights, which we won't go into today. It's climate change. But there's such a large constituency. Why doesn't it become the hot button? Why don't Republicans and Democrats try to get that climate change swing vote to win Ohio, to win the presidency, et cetera, et cetera? What's happening in each of our denominations or in general? Can that ever be a swing vote? The environment, the religious people with an environmental interest.
Candidates have to make it an issue. And I've heard
How's that done?
environmental leaders chastise the former Democratic candidate, for example, for not making his position on climate change more known. Now, Mr. Kerry maintains he gave a number of speeches on it, and I'm sure he did. But the obvious conclusion is it wasn't a top-tier issue.
People need to put pressure on politicians, and days like this help that to happen, it seems to me. Just the more people believe the science and recognize that it's a real issue, it comes from us. This is a democracy. We need to pressure.
For me, this must not be only the issue of scientists.
Right.
Yeah.
It has to be also the issue of clergy. We, the clergy, have to speak on this issue from the pulpit on daily basis and weekly basis. We need to educate our community members. We need to empower them to go out and make a difference.
And you also have to talk about the difference between breadth and depth. Is this something that a lot of people share, but it's this much, or something that they really feel passionately
Deeply, yeah.
about? Yeah. And that we live in a political system that takes advantage of adversarial relationships, that when you can create a conflict on some level, that's good for politics, that's how you run your elections, by saying how you're different from somebody. And so we need to not be ruled by that part of politics that says we have to fight with each other, and let's take the issues that divide us the most and lift them up the highest.
I think Larry, I don't think climate change should be a partisan issue, really. I know that candidates need to explain their positions. Bob Casey, running for the Senate in Pennsylvania, explained his last night. I thought he did an excellent job. I think the candidates should be pressed to explain their positions, but I don't believe it's a red state, blue state, in other words, a Republican or a Democrat or even a green issue. I revert back to what I said before. It's fundamentally a moral issue and a spiritual issue. And that's because, from my vantage point, God owns it. We don't own it. That is the earth.
What is the practical pressure point where you get an actual result, like a piece of legislation or a promise from a candidate or even a bipartisan panel? Where's the pressure point?
The first pressure point is for candidates to learn to expect that when a religious group comes to visit them, that this is one of the things that they want to hear about. I know, and I'm sure Iman Hendi hears this from the other side, that when a Jewish group goes to Congress, the congressman assumes that we want to hear about the Middle East. And what we have to communicate as Jews in particular is, it's not that that's not an important issue, but there are other things that we care about, and we think that the environment is a Jewish issue, is an issue that Jews want to hear about. And so when you come and talk to our synagogues, or we come and visit you, or you send us a letter, this is one of the things that we really want to hear about.
But it's not been a politically salient issue. You would agree, Daniel?
Not yet.
It's not been. It's been in the single digits of the percentage of Americans who will cast a vote based upon environment, much less climate change. But I think we have to make it a politically salient issue because it shouldn't be partisan. It should be something government and all leaders are held accountable for. And thus, that's our job, and I think we can make that happen.
Maybe it's because this issue is being debated only amongst the elite. Or maybe in college campuses, when I think it has to become a part of the culture on the street. People need to debate these issues in their churches, homes, with their children, with their neighbors on a daily basis. And if it becomes a part of the culture, I think politicians will look seriously into this matter.
Let's stick with, the people give high polling answers on good things. Do you go to church? They all say yes, Did you go vote this year? They all, high rates of yes. So a lot of people say the environment's an important thing, but the question is what they do about it voting-wise. What are your organizations doing? And then we're going to move to some internet questions. Where you're really overcoming things, where Jews and Muslims say, well, forget about that and let's work on ecological issues, or modernists and fundamentalists even, let's say let's bite the bullet. Richard Cizik and E.O. Wilson, there's history, talking about some possible. What's the state of things now?
Well, I think there are lots of different places where you can bring religious groups in. And one of the things that we need to do as religious leaders is to make that first step into this as a topic as easy as possible. Whether we're talking about personal behavior, or institutional behavior, or political behavior, that part of our job is to make is to understand and explain the science clearly and relatively simply, and then to say to people, okay, now here are some concrete things that you can do, whether those again are whatever sphere that they're working on. As you mentioned, one of the sponsors of this is Interfaith Power and Light, which has about 20 groups across the country in different states, and I'm part of Greater Washington Interfaith Power and Light. And what we try to do, the top line on our brochure is making a difference has never been easier. That we want to show people that they can do something about climate change, whether that's education, preaching, changing light bulbs in their synagogue, buying green power. That there are things to do, and we will help them do that. We will sit with them. We will sit on them until they will do these things together.
The great social movements in America, and I happen to think that this is one, that is climate change, much akin, I think, to civil rights. I believe it's easily argued that climate change is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. But every great social movement, you started out by talking about Jonathan Edwards.
Green Puritans,
and
right.
Presbyterians like myself during the Revolutionary War were called the black robes of the Revolution. But every major social movement in American history has always been tied to some form of changing of national legislation. That's just reality. It was the Civil Rights Movement, the passage of major bills in Congress. Voting Rights Act, for example, Fair Housing Act. These were all major bills in Congress that the American public had to either resonate to or not. Get their legislators to vote for or against. And fortunately, for the benefit of all Americans, black Americans particularly, they voted for these in the 60s. Today, there is, on this issue, I want to remind people, a piece of legislation in the last Congress. It was called the Climate Stewardship Act. It got 38 votes in the United States Senate. And that's obviously not half. It's not enough to pass. And yet, before the conclusion of last summer, there was the Domenici-Bingaman resolution. It was a matter of force of law, but it was nonetheless a sense of the Senate that the Senate, should pass a cap-and-trade free market mechanism to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And we got 54 United States senators, Republicans and Democrats, to vote for it. Now, not all did. A significant percentage of Republican senators voted against it, but nonetheless, I happen to think that you have to hold politicians accountable for national legislation. And look, there are over 200 cities, I understand, that have acted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have a host of regies or regional governments that have acted, but I happen to believe, and I have met with business leaders, some of the top business leaders, such as Jim Rogers, who's the new CEO of Duke Energy, who believe, Mr. Rogers believes that we have to have a kind of cap-and-trade program. That's a federal bill. And I happen to believe, and so do the leaders that signed this evangelical statement a few months ago, that that kind of national legislation is what's called for.
And the concrete things are really what's interesting to hear about. We're going to look at that a little bit more. I'm going to go up in the ether again. All of our panelists here are Scripture scholars of a sort. And we have an excellent question from our audience here. What scriptures do each of the traditions use against an environmental ethic? I can think of the ones in the Quran and the Old and New Testament. The world's going to end, so why try to fix the climate? But what are the scriptures that are used against the environment or misused? Yes, Rabbi.
The most famous one, and there was a whole series of articles back and forth from a scientist by the name of Lynn White, who looked at creation, at religion in the environment in the 60s. In the Western traditions, is from Genesis 1 that talks about that humanity's role is to subdue creation. The simplest argument against that is, if you read that in context, if you don't pull it out, you understand that was that what was meant by subdue is incredibly different from what we've been doing to the world. That Adam and Eve were not even permitted to eat meat, so they weren't allowed to kill animals for food, and so subdue clearly isn't this free license to do everything. You also have to read that in the context of Genesis 2, which happens to follow Genesis 1, and which says that humans are put on the earth to shamar and avad it, to avad, sometimes translated as to till or to work, but it also means to serve God, and shamar, to keep it, but it's the guarding of something that isn't yours. So that's one of the key ones that gets cited, this notion of subduing creation, and there's a pretty good answer to it.
Imam Hindi, with all respect to the Quran, what do you see of these kind of abuses, perhaps?
Honestly, I for the last 2 minutes, I was really trying to navigate through the Quran to find a verse that was historically used in that way. I really did not find really a verse in that way. Someone came to Prophet Muhammad and said, well, the earth is going to end, the day of judgment is going to happen, let me sit back and wait.
No such verse.
Muhammad said, no. God will not ask you about when the day of judgment will happen, but rather what have you done to get to that point. If the day of judgment were to happen and you have a tree in your hand, continue to plant it, because that is what a Muslim is supposed to do. Maintaining the earth is a divine mandate for Muslims, and not doing so is actually violating that divine mandate.
Alida?
Well, we have sort of expanded our definition of Scripture, but I think the ones we call on the most are the prophetic tradition. Do not, you shall not sell the needy for silver and so forth. And I can only say about that we have considered environmentalism an elitist issue, and that we tend to focus on, human suffering in the world, and civil rights issues, poverty issues, and consider this a little more of a, second-tier importance. And so, to the extent that we use Scripture in our advocacy.
And Reverend Cizik, what?
Well, Rabbi has already hit the main points, but I would say that, look, Christians have been blamed by green ethicists for having justified, for example, the exploitation of the Earth's resources, blamed for the exploitation, you see, of the Earth, including for climate change. The Bible doesn't allow you to do that. The Quran doesn't allow you to do it. The dominion passage, you call it subduing the earth, of Genesis 1:28, dominion, exercising dominion over all the things of the earth, the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, is balanced, you see, by Genesis 2, which says you protect it, you care for it. I tell you, I have checked with biblical preachers and scholars, and I've found that very few are acquainted with Revelation 11:18, the last book of the Scriptures, which says in a judgment passage, this is a holy word of God, that God will judge those who destroy the earth, and indeed it says he will destroy those who destroy the earth. Now that is an incredible verse, because if you believe that politicians, public officials, are to be held accountable, and we've just had Easter, Christians have just had Easter, Jesus said to Pilate, who had told him, I can release you or crucify you, Jesus said, you have no power except it be given you from above. In other words, he's saying that the highest political leader of his day is to be held responsible to a higher authority. And if you believe that, and you take seriously the Scriptures which say that God will destroy those who destroy the earth, I couldn't myself, as a politician in this town, not consider that reality, that spiritual reality.
I want to just comment. Islam defines the word terrorism as being any act of terror carried out against people and the earth.
Interesting.
Of course, one would wonder how that, looking into what's going on around the world in the name of Islam, how can that be the case? Without any doubt, those terrorists who come from an Islamic background are violating the very faith that they speak for. So in Islam, the Arabic word is hiraba. Hiraba, or terrorism, is an act of terror carried out against people and against land, to the point that some Muslim jurists said that the punishment of those who do that is capital punishment, because to carry out violence against the land is an absolute violence against God himself.
So scriptures are fairly severe if you're defending the environment.
Absolutely.
All across. We're getting some questions targeted now, but we'll expand them. So Rabbi Swartz, this is sort of a rabbinical question. Okay. In an issue like slavery, it's an absolute moral wrong. Right. We understand that now. Is there any such issue in the environmental or climate change context that is absolutely wrong? Is there anything that you would call a sin in your traditions regarding being a bad environmentalist?
As you may know, you mentioned the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew at the beginning, and he has declared hurting the environment a sin. That language doesn't, the sin language doesn't work as well so often in Judaism, but something that is evil. You just have to go to actually a section of Leviticus that I'm going to be studying with some fifth graders on Sunday, where it teaches us, you shall not stand idly by your neighbor's blood. And the way that has been interpreted by rabbis through the generations is that you can't make your livelihood from something that hurts other people. Now, if you interpret that very broadly, well, there's nothing that we do that doesn't affect somebody somewhere in some negative fashion. But in a real concrete way, what this is saying is that making a living always comes second to how we treat other people. And if you can show that certain ways of making a living that in the past were considered okay just hurt people all the time, then yes, they're wrong, and we've got to figure out an alternative. Now, if you say generating electricity from coal is wrong, and you say that today, well, tomorrow we can't turn off all the coal power plants. We've got to figure out a logical and feasible way to do that.
Let's bring it down to individuals. When should an individual feel possibly this kind of guilt, of a slaveholder even, on an ecological matter?
On a regular basis, because guilt is good for you.
Okay. We'll generalize it just for the help of everyone. So.
Well, even if acts of consumption, for example, are selfish, that doesn't make them necessarily sinful. After all, breathing is selfish, right? Essentially selfish, but it's not sinful. But look, this is a sin, Larry, in my mind, this is often a sin of omission, not commission. It's the act undone that's the sin of omission. For example, Christians pray regularly the Lord's Prayer, the great petition. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. This is, in theological understanding, the earthing of heaven. The earthing of heaven. And yet, what are the kingdom values? The kingdom values of heaven, you see, we know from, for example, Matthew 6:19. Store up your treasures not on earth where rust and moths consume, the scriptures say, for in heaven neither moths nor rust consume. And the parallelism here is really between moths, you see, and consuming. On earth we consume things. They become extinct. But in heaven, this passage teaches, things don't become extinct. They don't end by consumption. And so the heavenly kingdom value is to bring that kind of renewing, that kind of unselfish behavior to earth. That is what it means when it really isn't interpreted that way by most Christians who pray this prayer every week. And so I say that consuming, being a good consumer, we all are that. We have to do that to some degree. Though in a biblical context means being just and discerning. so that the material world is sustained, renewed, and not exploited. That is what it really means to pray the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And if we adopted that kind of an ideal, look, there are 50 to 75 million evangelicals in America alone. If we adopted that kind of an ideal of not, just making things go extinct, but desiring to renew, replenish, all these things, then wouldn't that say something about what we do as consumers? And wouldn't that say a lot about the importance of climate change if, in fact, it's hurting millions? I have to say, my friend Imam, the palace in Morocco allowed me a plane to fly way out into the Sahara. And what is occurring there is desertification. And where does that come from? Well, in part, we are 4% of the world's population here in America, but we have 25%, a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions. Here we, in this country, with our lifestyle, are contributing to something that is affecting those in northern Africa, where every year the Sahara grows, and where we're told by environmental scientists into the 21st century the waters from the rivers will dry up. Already you see that the snow on Mount Kilimanjaro is going. Doesn't that say something to us?
Yeah. Do Unitarians still believe in sin? Maybe for the environment. Tell us about that very briefly.
I think it all has to do with language for us. Yes. The word sin means missing the mark. And we strive to seek what the mark is and go for it. I'm kind of missing the presence of a Buddhist voice here today, because that's what comes to my mind. The golden mean, moderation in all things. I feel it's the role of all religions in all times to lead us and urge us away from an addictive, materialistic, pleasure-seeking kind of life, and urge us toward really the greater fulfillment of spiritual life. All religions are trying to do that for us. So I think I also like to interpret sin as ignorance. That also is a Buddhist interpretation. If we knew better. So it's about mindfulness, it's about teaching, it's about example.
In light of this discussion, things that came to my mind are, number one, are we consuming something we do not really need?
Interesting.
In other words, are we doing soul searching within ourselves, in our communities, in terms of how we live our life? I think we do need to ask ourselves many questions, and all the religions ask us, always, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, to challenge ourselves with certain questions that may challenge certain practices that we do every day.
Well, let me ask
you. The concept of fasting in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam contributes to that. Sort of alienate yourself from a basic need and ask yourself a certain question about your habits and if they need to be changed.
I was recently decided to try the discipline of Lent. I said, well, I think I'll try that. And I found it a very enlightening experience to give up something. I gave up TV for 6 weeks. And I went through a very interesting series of insights with that. And the biggest one being, we need to loosen our attachments to things. Yeah. We need to get past an addictive reaction to having things that give us pleasure. Yeah. And
so is owning an SUV a sin? We won't go into that. I don't know the statistics on that. But.
Let me say this, that I think for a pastor in a church, and frankly, there in the evangelical world is one new megachurch almost every 2 weeks. That means a church that's gone from 1,999 members to 2,000 members. Every 2 weeks we have another church enter the category of megachurch. And the reason for using that as an illustration, these are huge consumptions of energy to run a church. And so the question then logically could be asked, if we're impacting the world's poor, most of all, by our greenhouse gas emissions, then wouldn't it make sense for every church to adopt what is available ready today by the United States government, an Energy Star program that gives them an energy audit that says this is what your eco footprint as a congregation is, as a church. If you were to switch to compact fluorescence alone, this could be saved. Never mind the fact that churches have fleets of buses that ought to be changed to, more economical and more environmental friendly types of transportation. So I am of a mind to say, to answer your original question, yes, that to leave an ecological footprint that will last in the atmosphere for 1,000 years, which is what greenhouse gas emissions do. They stay there for 1,000 years. And when you consider this fact, we, in the last 20 years as Americans, have consumed more energy, I've read, in 20 years than all the previous generations going back to the Industrial Revolution. Now, if that's the truth, and I believe it is, then what does that say about us? And what does that say we're giving our children in the atmosphere for 1,000 years that will change their lives forever? You talk about intergenerational
and I want to
sin.
Say that. I want to say
that is sin.
Yes.
In my opinion, there's no question with a capital S.
We've mentioned the poor, intergenerational ethics. We're going to move on to that. But Reverend Sally Bingham in San Francisco has called in. And since evangelicals are such a large constituency, and they may have a big problem with science, very briefly, what would you do to change their view on science so that they support the climate change solutions? What would you do? Couple sentences.
You mean Sally called in?
I don't know who Reverend Bingham is.
Sally Bingham?
Yes.
With Interfaith Power.
Okay, well, we have a
say hello to Sally. I say to Sally, who is an Episcopal priest in San Francisco. By the way, I spoke to her last week, and she said the local bishop was going to give his first sermon over Easter on climate change. Very first sermon on climate change. So I say hello to Sally out there. And she knows as well as I do that this is a hurdle. Convincing, you see, people of the science. And to me, it's simply a crime that today, in the 21st century, people will allow their religious views about the relationship between religion and science to impact what is now occurring in the world. You see, third world people that are going to be devastated and are already by their hostility to science. I don't have that hostility to science. I can accept the fact that Edwin O. Wilson, who doesn't share all of my faith views, is nonetheless absolutely right about climate change, and I respect him for it. By the way, he's a wonderful man, too.
And he was reared a Baptist.
Reared a Baptist.
He's still proud of that.
He has a new book coming out, by the way, called Creation, which I think we're all going to get to read this fall.
Just a side note, there have been studies about the number of sermons given on science and religion or nature.
Is that right?
And it's almost nil, mainly because in the cycles of the preaching year, you have Genesis maybe once or twice all year, and so the minister, Jewish and Christian, may mention the topic, but then they have other things to move on to for even the next 3 years in a sort of lectionary cycle. So perhaps more sermons, concrete, persuasive, got to fill our pulpits.
As long as we don't change the climate with too much hot air from our sermons.
Well, that's or you may lose people to the cause.
Even if you stick to the principles. Yeah. You don't have to turn the pulpit into a politician's.
It has been for 300 years in the United States. Let's move on to ethics. Now, this is a new idea: intergenerational equity. It's kind of a new ethic in Judeo-Christianity, perhaps Islam, that we should do what's going to affect our children and grandchildren. And every day you got to think about that when you do something. Is this new, and how will it get into people's?
The phrase certainly is new, but I think actually the opposite is the case. I think people felt this more in the past, and we've lost it, and now maybe we're starting to recover it. Right now, if you pass a regulation in the United States that's of significant size, it has to go through certain processes at the Office of Management and Budget. And one of those things that has to happen is that it has to get a cost-benefit analysis, and that projects out into the future. And the way they project it out into the future is they say that every year in the future is discounted at 7%, so it's worth 7% less than the year before, which means that about every 10 years, the future loses half its value. And that's standard procedure. It wasn't invented by the present administration. It's been around for a while.
It's like depreciation of
Right.
owning something.
But we're putting the future on a half-off sale every 10 years when we think about that. And I think that is a sin, frankly. I think that we are living life and we are setting politics and setting policies and doing our own behaviors as if there isn't a future. And if it's just impossible to read scriptures, whether you're talking about the Quran or the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, without seeing God as eternal. And eternal means a long, long, long time. And you hear the promises that God makes, the covenants that God makes in the Torah are L'olam va'ed, forever and further, or L'dor vador, specifically from generation to generation. And our promises are supposed to be from generation to generation. Now, I remember very distinctly as a young kid reading about the passenger pigeons that used to darken the skies, that a flock could go overhead, and one single flock could be there for hours at a time, flying literally hundreds of millions of birds, and being so pissed at past generations that had taken this thing from me. And my daughter, who's 6, will look, speaking of SUVs, at an SUV going by, and she'll say, "Daddy, that's a car that's a waste." And she'll say, and it's killing the polar bears, and I'll never get to see them.
And Mom, is there a favorite teaching or scripture from the Quran about this idea of connecting generations? Can you think of just one nugget for us?
You know, honestly, I was listening to the rabbi, and I said I could say the Imam said so, because it's almost the same, word by word. The same passage, the same reference from generation to generation, and the Quran talks about this, that you have to pass the message on from generation to generation, and the promise of God goes from generation to generation, and therefore our commitment is to honor that generation to generation passage. The Quran talks about what I call 3 values that should shape whatever we are talking about, whether ecology or anything else. Politics of justice. Number 2, economics of equity. Number 3, covenant of community. Politics of justice and justice for all, human beings and other than human beings. Economics of equity for all, and covenant of community, where all people come together for that shared value.
That's good. I like that. I have a sin. You referred to sin.
We won't stay on this too long.
No, long. But intergenerational equity. If there is sin in the fact that we destroy the Earth's atmosphere, in effect, for thousands of years by the emission of what is annually 700 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases, if there's a sin about this, it's in a scriptural sense, it's this. You have both for Christians special revelation, which is the revelation of Christ, and you have general revelation, which is revealed through the handiwork of God in all that's created. And what is occurring here is the marring of that general revelation, which is supposed to reveal God in all of His glory. I think Muslims would understand and share this. Sure. General revelation of God is being marred forever, so that our future, namely our children and our grandchildren, they won't be able to see the earth in the same way.
Mm-hmm. A couple of our questions, they're actually confirmations of what you've said. They're asking, don't we really need to just change the whole way people view life? Selfish to unselfish. And then all this information gets in. Well, I think you've agreed, and these are some of the questions you've received. We heard the word about the poor. And in our science panel, they all said we've got climate change, the earth is getting warmer, probably there's going to be a catastrophe. But no one wanted to say, I know what it's going to be or when it's going to be. There's all that uncertainty. But probably the most certain thing is that the non-rich people are going to be hurt the most. So how do you get that across so that people want to change their individual lives or change policy? When I was a newspaper reporter, we did countless stories on the homeless and the federal policy, and I don't know if people have any different feelings about the poor. On climate change and the poor, what do you suggest?
Well, there's two gaps that need to be bridged. The hard one that I don't have any special wisdom on is if somebody just doesn't care about other people. And how to get them to care about other people, that's a challenge. But just as important is the gap where you care about other people, but you don't understand how what you do affects them. It's this lack of knowledge is a sin. And the lack of connection, of seeing that community, where we don't understand that there are real people whose lives are today being affected by things that we don't think about, like flipping a light switch on or not flipping it off when we leave the room. And for me, the way that I started dealing with that was very personal. My wife and I adopted our daughter. I heard earlier there was a question from Andhra Pradesh to the scientists, and that's where my daughter comes from. And but before we knew that she was going to come from Andhra Pradesh, there was a period of time when we were in process for adoption where we didn't know literally which country our baby was going to come from, but knew based on the general length of time that this process would take that she was probably already born. So somewhere out in the world was our baby, and I didn't know where. And for that period of time, all of a sudden it became incredibly personal to me what happened to anybody anywhere. And if everybody could feel that, that it's their child out there somewhere, or their grandchild out there somewhere that they are affecting when they do this, I think we'd see some difference.
You see, this is the scripture of the heart that I was talking about. Our child also is an international adoptee who we have because of the poverty in his country. We know in our hearts what's right. We know.
Now, none of this will change the warming planet, as the scientist said. It's just too big for anybody. But this is an individual level of some kind of change in activity that empathy for the poor can promote. Is that what we're saying?
In Judaism, God does not ask you about the result of your work, but rather about the work you put in. And therefore, I think what matters is, are we trying our best as a human being to make a difference? What could happen in 50 years from now, I don't know, but I do my best to make a difference. Whether it works or not, it's really in the hands of God. The analogy I always use is that we all share one ship. Whether we are on the first deck, the second, or the third, whether we are Jews, Christians, or Muslims, or Buddhists, or atheists, or whatever it is, if the ship sinks, we will all sink with it. And if the ship gets to its final destination, we will all get there and sing the praises of God. In other words, we need to work together as shipmates to sail the ship to its final destination. The rich and the poor have to work with each other. The Jew, the Christian, the Muslim, the atheist, and those of faith have to work with each other to sail the land to its final destination. And to me, that is what really the challenge is all about.
That's wonderful. There's a rabbinic story about a ship where somebody doesn't get that part. It's a story from a Midrash on a commentary on Leviticus Rabbah. And it said that there was one man who had a drill with him on a ship, and he started drilling under his seat. And the other passengers are really upset. And they start yelling at him. And he says, "Why are you upset at me? I'm only drilling under my own seat."
Well, it's the golden rule. The scriptures teach the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And how can you pretend to obey the golden rule, the second great commandment after loving God, to love your neighbor, and behave in such a way? But look at the Western answer you see to, not signing the Kyoto Protocol was, since the United States and Australia are the two countries that have not, of all the countries in the world, is look at what the others emit. Look what China emits, and what has it done? Or India, what has it done? And here you're asking us to do this. Well, I adopt a slightly different ethic. It's not what I should have to do, but what can I do? And what should America do to lead the world in reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
That's a perfect segue. Yes.
I thought of one thing, that one of my favorite passages from the Christian Bible is Matthew 25:30-46. A wonderful passage. I hope every human being reads it, where Jesus divides his followers into two groups, the sheep and the goat. Those who found him naked and clothed him, and those who found him hungry and fed him. I think this is what should happen in this world. That the role of the rich is to reach out to the poor and feed them. And the pain of the poor becomes the pain of the rich. And the happiness of the poor becomes the happiness of the rich.
Okay. I'm going to ask an imam to come into some evangelical pastorates and preach from Matthew 25.
Done deal, sir.
I'm going to mix metaphors, and I'm going to take Kyoto and put you all in the same boat. Now figure that out. But I'm going to combine a few questions about ethics of American, our economy, the golden value of freedom. Do what you want, make as much as you want in America. We've had a few questions about that. So let's say you're all employers. Your ethic is to give them a job so that they can take care of their families. But a competing industry in India, which doesn't have to pay for regulating its smog, or in China, is winning the offshore business, and your company is about to go out of business. And if you spend money on improving the environmental work of your American company, you'll even lose your business quicker to India or China. So you've got an ethic. Are you going to help stop global warming, or are you going to take care of those employees who you may have to give the pink slip to because either as one question here, where you're just basically a greedy employer who wants to make a profit, or because China's going to put you out of business. So how do you make that choice? It's an impossible one, but let's hear what you say.
Well, there is a theologian by the name of Edward John Carnell who called these tragic moral choices. You have to make choices, and you do the best you can. I'm reminded of the story of King Darius and Daniel in the Old Testament, in which King Darius, you see, has to decide what to do about Daniel, his friend. This is King Darius, 6th century BC. He has to choose whether to, allow his friend Daniel to live or to throw him into the lion's den. Well, he throws him into the lion's den, and Daniel is saved. But nonetheless, the choice that King Darius has to make is to save the kingdom or save his friend. And King Darius, I think, wisely chooses to save the kingdom, not just his friend. And God saves his friend, Daniel. But look, we have politicians who I think in this town today, they're serving themselves, their re-election. They get hundreds of thousands of dollars to serve themselves for re-election at the expense, I think, of what is the public good. They're choosing, in effect, sometimes their own friends in the oil and gas industry. Excuse me for being so specific, but that's what's occurring. And the public be damned, and the world be damned. And I just think this is wrong. And so I don't happen to think, for example, because that argument is raised all the time, that we're going to destroy our economy. Look, the cities in America that have acted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, like Portland, have one of the most thriving economies on the West Coast. So, yes, you sometimes do have to make choices that are tough choices where people do lose their jobs. But I think in the end, opting for a green economy, we know from those businesses that have already made those choices and moved ahead to pay those costs, those businesses have prospered for their shareholders as well as their employees. So I don't find this to be that kind of a choice, because I happen to think that there are negative externalities, but the negative externalities are not moving toward green.
And probably jobs are going to change even if an environmental issue was not taking place. That's a moral dilemma, no matter what kind of human situation.
And the government clearly, I think, should have a role in thinking about how do we help ease that transition for those people who are particularly affected, particularly, the folks who are on the lower end of those industries, whether they be miners or whatever, who are facing a lot of the hazards and not getting a lot of the money. So the government can play a useful role in that transition, but there has to be that transition.
We've had some questions about concrete actions, and I think probably we've covered a lot of those. And you can make a congregation green, you could watch the energy, and I think some of the Earth Day Net websites have lots of those practical things. But here's a question about young people. The scientists in the panel said, get their minds while they're young. You encourage them into science, let them know that it's their future. Is this of interest? Are there youth movements among the religions now on this topic?
The children of today are the leaders of tomorrow. And if we were to focus on the children of today, I think we'll have a better tomorrow. Recently, when I was in Indonesia, I was surprised, to say the truth, to see what I call the young blood on campus that is really trying to make a difference in this regard. I thought that the questions at the end of my lecture would be about all kinds of issues, dictatorship or this or that. I was surprised 3 questions out of 11 were about environment and ecology, global warming, and what their response should be. So I was really surprised to see that in Indonesia. And a week after that was in Bangladesh, and so sort of the same thing. Maybe it's the internet that is making that possible, that people are communicating across oceans on this issue.
There's a great column in today's New York Times by Tom Friedman about young people at collegians, if you will, at Williams College who have a program doing it in the dark, and he thought, well, is this another sexual escapade? And come to find out, of course not. It's a program to become energy efficient. And the contest is between which dormitories on campus can be the most cost-effective, energy-efficient, and the rest. And I see this challenge already being accepted by evangelicals at our colleges. They want to do what's right. They know it's their future. And while we in our generation during the Vietnam War may have sat in on the administrator's office to protest the war in Vietnam, I didn't, but I sort of felt like doing that at times. I think today's generation, and Friedman suggested it, so I'll blame him, they maybe ought to consider sitting in the administrator's office until the college goes green. And maybe young collegians or Sunday school kids ought to consider sitting in the pastor's office until the church decides it's going to save energy.
And of course, you've written books for young people, and you're working with young adults who are learning about these kind of things.
Very devoted.
Here, this gets back again to what people can do. You know that old slogan, think globally, act locally. I guess we've covered that, haven't we? If you think big, you'll be motivated to do little things that may make a difference. Is that real?
Yeah. Let me tell you 2 ways that it's real for energy that you might not think about it for other things. The first is that we've got a new market here, and at this stage, it doesn't make economic sense to buy some of these products, like a Prius, which we have, or wind energy. But if enough people do it because it's the right thing to do, it'll make economic sense for everybody else. The second thing is that politics doesn't just happen on the national level. And if we can get some cities and counties and states to do these things, ultimately it has to be national. But we can move this ahead. And I think the religious community has a very constructive role that they can play in getting cities to adopt these things and getting towns to do this by showing that they want to do that. In D.C., the D.C. Energy Office has an initiative to try and go out and help the faith community become more energy efficient. And that's because the faith community asked for it, and they responded.
So think globally, act locally is a slogan that still works?
I don't know why not. I'm thinking in terms, as the only woman here, in terms of cleaning my house with baking soda and vinegar. This is something you can do to...
There's no soap to run off.
Yeah, well, there's no ammonia and bleach. It's much more environmentally friendly.
Okay.
Surveys. Go ahead.
It's in the way I talk with my child. It's the way I want them to buy things or get rid of something. The way I want them to live. And imagine if every house on that street does the same thing. My daughter, because she believes in these things, she's 7 years old. Believe me, every time she has a chance to speak with her neighbors with whom she plays about these things, she does. And I tell her, every time you do that, I'm going to sit down and do a song with you, because she loves to sing. And imagine, she loves to sing, and therefore she goes out to talk about these issues. And that becomes an issue in our street.
Okay. We're going to close now. I'm going to have to wrap it up. But I'd like to ask one question and get your 30-second response, okay? And I've saved this. This is the blockbuster movie question, the apocalypse, the end of the world. We're all scared to death. When you're scared, you do things. You get things done. So, in your views, how helpful is the apocalyptic sort of feeling about climate change? That if we don't do it, we're all going to die. It has its place, right? But give me your thoughts in these last 30 seconds each, and then we're going to wrap up.
I was amazed to hear about the idea of planting the tree, because there's also a Jewish tradition from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that's identical. The notion is, if you hear the Messiah is coming and you have a sapling in your hand, first plant the sapling and then go and greet the Messiah. Yes, sometimes we move when we get scared, but sometimes we move in really stupid directions. So I'd rather see us do this out of love than out of fear.
I know fear can be a motivation. Look, some people think all the evangelicals are sort of armchair Armageddonists ready for the second coming to come, and we're going to let the earth go to hell in a handbasket before then. This is simply not true. 51% of evangelicals say they'll even pay higher costs of energy and even tolerate the loss of jobs if it means stopping global warming. So, look, we're prepared to take action. I don't think fear is the best motivation. I happen to think love is. One quick illustration: a woman in a focus group says, "Look, I can't imagine that two of my grandchildren, I have 16, she's an African American woman, are impacted, you see, by mercury poisoning in our nation's atmosphere from coal burning utility plants." And the white man, male in his 50s, leans over to this African American woman in her 60s and says, "Lady," he says, "we do have a power plant in our area." She said, "After all, we don't have any power plants in our area." And he leaned over and put his hand on hers and he said, "Lady, we not only have a power plant here, I work for it." And together they began to talk about the reality of what pollution does to our future generations, and how even working for a power plant, hey, that's his job. But he came to the conclusion at the end of that meeting that he was going to do something about this issue. Isn't that interesting?
And the apocalypse is Reverend
I think it's
Acosta.
people. It's people. It's people caring. I say we're not tree huggers, we're people huggers. Nothing wrong with being a tree hugger.
And that's because evangelicals have the apocalyptic rap. So we gave Richard that extra time. Reverend Acosta.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is a conversion kind of moment. You know, when I see a drowning polar bear because of melting ice floes, I feel a conversion. I feel a shift in myself of what kind of priority this is. And, you know, I think that's what we need. I think we need conversion all over the place in this country to recognize the urgency of the situation.
Imam Hindi.
I think we need to respond to God, and the only way to respond to God is to respond to His creation. Honoring God's creation is honoring God Himself. I do it out of love, not out of fear of what may happen.
Thank you very much for joining us. It was a fast 2 hours. Can you believe it? We'd like to thank again Earth Day Network for this religious response to climate change, a panel televised nationally. And I think they're going to be, if it's good, they'll put it in some kind of permanent form for downloading or DVDs. So, you know, you can, a lot of very astute comments here today. And this kicks off a 3-year educational campaign of the Earth Day Network organization. So keep posted for what's going to happen the next 3 Earth Days and I guess every week in between. Thank you very much.